A single Saturday morning unraveled into something no one on that street could have predicted. An ordinary routine disrupted by a confrontation that grew darker with every passing second. Neighbors frozen behind curtains as a spectacle unfolded that would expose hidden motives, false power, and a revelation so sharp it cut through the entire illusion of control. What looked like a simple dispute over rules became the stage for a truth so shocking that the community would never see their quiet block the same way again. Stay tuned, hit like, subscribe for more gripping stories, and share in the comments what you think about this plot and where you're watching from. On a quiet Saturday morning in Plano, Texas, Derek Williams stepped out of his two-story brick home with the simple task of carrying the trash bag down to the curb, expecting nothing more dramatic than the sound of lawnmowers humming in the distance or children's bikes rattling along the sidewalks. The air was already warm with the Texas sun climbing higher. Sprinklers hissed across neatly trimmed lawns, and the neighborhood projected the illusion of safety and peace that people paid dearly to maintain. Yet, as Derek walked down his driveway, the weight of the trash bag tugging at his arm, he quickly noticed three figures waiting at the edge of the concrete. Figures who shattered any sense of ordinary routine. Standing firmly as if they owned the space, two men dressed in mismatched black tactical vests bore the stitched phrase "Community Enforcement" across their chests. Between them stood Janet Moore, the Homeowners Association president, notorious for her sharp words and obsession with enforcing the rules. Derek immediately sensed this was not a casual encounter. He stopped short, his eyes narrowing as he studied the so-called enforcers. One vest was obviously too large for the tall, bald man who wore it, the Velcro straps hanging loose like a costume poorly fitted. His mirrored sunglasses reflected Derek's face back at him, but behind them, Derek knew there was nervousness. The shorter one, broad-shouldered with a messy beard, had boots that looked worn down and scuffed, as if they had been dug out of a thrift store bin. They tried to look authoritative, but their posture was too stiff, too practiced, the way actors stand when they are unsure of their lines. And Derek, more than anyone, could read men like these. He had seen real authority, and this was not it. Janet crossed her arms tightly, her lips pressed into a thin line, and called out, "Mr. Williams, we need to talk." Derek set the trash bag down gently onto the pavement, letting it rest like an anchor at his feet, and rested his hands casually on his hips. His voice was calm but carried an edge. "About what?" he asked. The tall imposter stepped forward, his shadow stretching across Derek's driveway, and spoke in a voice that tried to mimic command but only sounded forced. "Community enforcement," he said flatly. "You're in violation of neighborhood regulations. We're here to detain you until police arrive." Derek almost let out a laugh, but instead tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable, though a glint of amusement flickered in his eyes. "Detain me," he repeated, his tone low and deliberate. Janet, seizing the silence, jumped in quickly. "You've ignored repeated notices. This has gone too far. We can't have someone undermining our community rules. These men are here to make sure you comply." The bearded man reached into his vest and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He opened it and began reading aloud with the theatricality of someone who wanted desperately to believe his words carried weight. "Property code violations. Unauthorized modifications to your driveway. Loud gatherings. Non-compliance with HOA directives." The list went on, delivered as if it were a criminal indictment. Derek's lips curved into something close to a smirk. "So you think that gives you the right to walk onto my property? And what was it, detain me?" His voice was controlled, almost mocking. The tall man's jaw clenched, and his hand twitched near his belt, suggesting a threat he couldn't quite commit to. "That's right," the imposter said, doubling down on the charade. "You can come peacefully, or we'll make it harder on you." For a moment the street fell still, as if every noise had been swallowed by the weight of the words. Derek could sense eyes on him from multiple directions. Curtains shifted across the block, blinds tilted, and phones began to rise in the windows. He even noticed a boy a few houses down leaning on his basketball, his gaze fixed intently on the confrontation. The entire neighborhood was beginning to witness something that was bigger than trash bags and HOA rules. Derek took a single slow step forward, his voice steady but edged with steel. "Let me explain something to you. There is no such thing as community enforcement. You are not law enforcement. You have no legal authority here, and right now, you are trespassing on my property." Janet's face turned red, her cheeks heating with frustration. "Don't talk to me about authority, Derek. You think you're above the rules because of who you are. We've had real complaints, and I will not let you drag this neighborhood down." The bearded man shifted uncomfortably, his bravado thinning with every second, but the taller one remained stiff, his pride forcing him to stand straighter. Derek locked his gaze onto him, reading his body language as easily as he would read a book. He had dealt with dangerous men before, men whose threats were not rehearsed, but deadly. Compared to them, these two were amateurs. But amateurs could still be reckless, and recklessness could get someone hurt. So Derek kept his cool, though beneath the surface, his training was already guiding him, preparing for what might come. He gave them a thin smile that carried no warmth. "You picked the wrong driveway today," he said softly. His words carried further than his volume suggested, and Janet's composure faltered for a fraction of a second. The neighborhood seemed to collectively hold its breath. From a porch across the street, a door creaked open, and someone whispered loud enough for others nearby to hear. "What is she thinking bringing people like that here?" Derek's eyes flicked between them, taking in the nervous twitch of the tall man's jaw and the uneasy shifting of the bearded man's stance. They were imposters, that much was obvious. But the illusion they tried to create was meant to intimidate not just him, but the entire block watching from behind curtains and half-open doors. The bearded man unfolded the piece of paper again, holding it as if it were an arrest warrant, though the cheap creases and smudges betrayed its lack of authenticity. He read aloud with forced seriousness: property violations, non-compliance with HOA regulations, unauthorized modifications to your driveway, repeated noise disturbances, and failure to observe neighborhood standards. Each charge was delivered with a tone that begged the audience to believe it was official. But Derek heard nothing more than hollow accusations stitched together by desperation. He let the silence hang, then replied coolly, "So you think that gives you the right to come onto my property and threaten to detain me?" The tall man, whom Janet introduced earlier as Eddie Barnes, straightened his shoulders, trying to make his frame appear even larger, his mirrored shades reflecting Derek's calm expression. "That's right," Eddie said firmly, though his voice carried the crack of insecurity. "You can come peacefully, or we'll make it harder on you." Derek studied him for a moment, then shifted his gaze toward Janet, whose face was flushed with self-righteous fury. "And you're standing here thinking this is lawful? Thinking two men in bargain bin gear and a list of trumped-up complaints give you authority?" Janet's lips curled into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You don't understand, Derek. This isn't about one violation. It's about a pattern of disrespect. This community depends on rules, and when someone ignores them, they undermine the very fabric of order we built. We are not going to stand by while you set your own standards." Derek's tone dropped into something steady, calm, but edged with disdain. "Rules keep order, Janet, but intimidation isn't order. And what you're doing now isn't enforcement, it's harassment." Eddie bristled at the word, taking a bold step closer, the gravel crunching under his boots. "You better watch your mouth," he barked, though the sweat beading along his forehead betrayed how badly he wanted control he didn't actually have. The bearded man, Sean Miller, shifted from one foot to the other, glancing sideways at Janet as though seeking reassurance. Derek noticed it all, the doubt creeping into Sean's posture, the desperate need for dominance radiating from Eddie, and Janet's growing frustration that her carefully staged display wasn't unfolding the way she planned. Neighbors were no longer subtle in their attention. Windows slid open, phones tilted outward, voices whispered. A teenager across the street, Caleb Johnson, raised his phone higher, muttering something about going live. Derek caught the motion and gave the slightest nod in his direction, a signal of acknowledgement, but also a silent reminder that truth would outlive bluffs. Janet pointed at Derek as if pronouncing judgment. "You've had warnings. You've racked up fines. You've ignored letters and phone calls. We can't allow someone like you to bring down this neighborhood." That's why these men are here, to ensure compliance once and for all. Derek arched a brow at her phrasing. Someone like me? Careful how you finish that thought, Janet. She hesitated, her mouth snapping shut for a moment, as if she realized she had nearly crossed a line too revealing, a line that would betray prejudice more than principle. But Eddie, hungry to reassert control, didn't notice the nuance. "We don't need to explain ourselves," he said loudly, chest puffed out, trying to impress the woman who had orchestrated this spectacle. "You're non-compliant. That's all that matters." Derek's smirk was barely perceptible, but it carried enough weight to needle Eddie further. Non-compliant with what? Real law? Federal statutes? Or the made-up authority stitched onto your vest? The crowd behind blinds stirred more audibly, a ripple of murmurs moving down the block. The illusion Janet and her enforcers were trying to maintain was crumbling with every exchange. Derek could feel it, and so could they. Sean finally spoke, his voice lower, almost hesitant. "Look, this doesn't have to get ugly. Just come with us, wait for the officers, and we'll let them sort it out. Maybe they'll go easy on you if you cooperate." Derek's tone sharpened. "Officers? Do you mean real police or the fake badges you two probably ordered online? Because I promise you, when actual law enforcement shows up, they won't be asking me the hard questions. They'll be asking you why you thought you could play dress up and walk onto someone's property with threats." Janet snapped, her voice rising. "Don't twist this. You think you can bend the rules, ignore authority, and make this neighborhood bow to your behavior. But not anymore. I'm done letting you disrespect everything we've worked for." Derek's gaze was locked on her, calm but firm. "Respect isn't forced, Janet. It isn't created by fines, threats, or two men in sloppy gear. Respect is earned, and right now, you've lost every ounce of it." The words hit her harder than she expected, her jaw tightening as her eyes darted toward the watching houses, realizing that every sentence, every glare, every threat was being cataloged by neighbors who were finally seeing the truth of who she was. Sean Miller, the shorter bearded accomplice, kept glancing at the homes surrounding them, nervous about the curtains twitching and the cameras pointed in their direction. Derek knew men like this, men who fed off intimidation until the weight of a real challenge forced them to reveal their weakness. He also knew Janet's type, self-important leaders who mistook rules for righteousness and forgot that respect couldn't be manufactured through threats. He allowed the silence to stretch just long enough for every neighbor watching to feel the tension. Then he spoke, his tone calm but edged like steel. "Let me make something clear. You're not law enforcement. You don't get to walk onto my property, wave around some paper, and pretend you can detain me. This isn't a game, and you're trespassing." Eddie clenched his jaw and stepped forward with calculated aggression, gravel crunching under his boots as if the sound alone could substitute for real power. "You think we're playing?" he demanded, his voice deeper but strained. "You're resisting. That gives us every right to escalate." Derek tilted his head, the corner of his mouth twitching in a humorless smirk. "Escalate? You're standing here in vests that don't even fit, quoting rules you don't understand. And you're going to lecture me about escalation? Son, I've dealt with men who made entire cities bleed, and they had more restraint than you're showing now." Eddie froze at the comparison, but Janet stepped in before his faltering composure could show. "Don't try to intimidate us with your past, Derek," she snapped, her voice rising high enough for neighbors to hear. "This is about the community, not you. We have a system, and if you can't follow it, then maybe you don't belong here at all." The phrase struck Derek like a spark against dry tinder. He caught it instantly. Janet's almost careless slip, her hint of exclusion that dripped with more venom than she realized. His eyes narrowed, and though his tone stayed controlled, the steel in his words sharpened. "People like me, Janet? Careful how you finish that thought." Sean shifted uneasily, muttering under his breath, "This doesn't feel right." But Eddie ignored him, straightening again as if the crowd's presence forced him to double down. "We're not leaving," Eddie declared. "You come with us now, or we'll restrain you." The words, empty of true legal force, nevertheless landed heavily in the hot Texas air. The crowd stirred again. From across the street, a voice rang out, a man who had stepped onto his porch to watch. Leave him alone. We all see what's happening." Derek glanced sideways, just long enough to catch the man's stern gaze before turning back to Eddie and Janet. His voice was quieter now, meant for them but loud enough for the audience to hear. "This is your last chance. Walk away before you find out what happens when the police show up and realize what you've done here." Janet's cheeks burned, her fists tightening at her sides. "You think you can threaten us into silence," she spat. "We're doing what needs to be done. You've broken the rules, ignored fines, disrespected the order we've built. We won't let you drag this neighborhood down." Derek's eyes flicked to the phone's recording, the lenses capturing every detail of Janet's tirade, and he knew she was too blinded by pride to realize she was indicting herself in front of the very neighbors she claimed to defend. He took another step forward, his presence radiating a calm authority that neither Eddie nor Sean could imitate. "Respect doesn't come from fake cops and staged arrests," he said evenly. "Respect comes from trust, and you've burned through every ounce of it." A hush fell over the street as his words lingered in the summer air, a verdict that neighbors seemed to agree with. Murmurs spread, whispers growing louder, and the power Janet thought she commanded slipped further from her grasp. Sean wiped his palms on his vest nervously, the weight of the crowd's judgment pressing on him like a vice. "Maybe we should just wait in the street," he muttered to Eddie, but Eddie barked back without turning his head. "No, we finish this." The tension ratcheted tighter, the moment hanging on the edge of something combustible. Caleb Johnson, still holding his phone high, shouted, "Mr. Williams, I've got you on live. Thousands are watching." Eddie's head snapped toward him, his composure breaking as he barked, "Put that down," and took a step in Caleb's direction. That was the wrong move. Derek instantly shifted, planting himself between Eddie and the teenager, his body language protective, his voice sharp and cutting. "You even think about touching that kid, and this ends here and now." Eddie stopped dead in his tracks, the threat of Derek's stance far more real than the empty authority he had been wielding moments before. The neighbors reacted audibly, some gasping, others murmuring words of support. A woman cradling her baby on a porch shouted, "Neighborhood matter? Looks like harassment to me." The voices carried, louder and angrier, feeding the momentum that was turning the crowd against Janet and her enforcers. Derek didn't need to raise his voice further. The community itself was becoming his amplifier. He stood tall, every inch of his posture radiating calm authority. "You want to talk about escalation?" he asked, eyes locked on Eddie. "Escalation is what happens when you mistake fear for respect. And right now, the only thing you're earning is a front row seat in a police car." Eddie flinched, though he tried to mask it behind his mirrored lenses. Janet, desperate to regain ground, shouted, "Don't listen to him. He's manipulating you all. He thinks he can bully his way out of this." But the neighbors weren't buying it anymore. Janet Moore, however, doubled down on her stance, her arms folded tightly across her chest, as if crossing them harder could make her argument stronger. "Don't be fooled," she shouted to no one in particular, her voice carrying across the lawns. "He's manipulating all of you, twisting this to make himself look like a victim." Derek glanced around at the houses, taking in the growing number of open doors and porches with neighbors standing shoulder to shoulder, some whispering, others recording. The illusion Janet had tried to construct was unraveling, and the audience she had inadvertently invited was now becoming her jury. Caleb Johnson's voice carried above the murmurs as he announced proudly, "You're live, Mr. Williams. Thousands are watching." Eddie's face tightened, the confidence he had clung to waning as he realized that the phones weren't just props but potential evidence. Every word, every gesture, every bluff recorded and immortalized. Derek seized on that shift, his voice cutting through the thick summer air. "This is what real authority looks like, Eddie. Not a vest you bought online, not words rehearsed in front of a mirror, but accountability. And every single person here is holding you accountable." Sean's eyes darted nervously to Janet, his voice low, but audible enough for nearby neighbors to catch. "Maybe we should pull back. This isn't what we signed up for." Janet spun on him with fury. "Don't you dare back down now. He's been undermining this neighborhood for months, and if we let him win here, none of this means anything." Derek's smirk was faint, but it landed with precision. You hear yourself, Janet? None of this is about rules. It's about you, about control. And now the people you thought would quietly back you up are finally seeing the truth. The murmurs from the neighbors grew louder, less restrained, ripples of discontent spreading as more voices joined in. A woman with a toddler balanced on her hip shouted from her porch, "This isn't enforcement, this is harassment." Another man, standing with folded arms near his garage, called out, "You don't have the right, Janet, not with fake cops and threats." Derek let their words linger, letting the community itself do the work of dismantling Janet's authority. He knew that sometimes the most powerful tool wasn't a weapon or a badge, but the undeniable truth spoken aloud by witnesses. Janet's composure faltered, her face reddening as she realized the tide was turning against her. Still, Eddie wasn't ready to let go, his pride forcing him to step forward again, his posture stiff with determination. "You think you can talk your way out of this, Williams?" he sneered, though his voice cracked ever so slightly, betraying the fragility of his act. "You're coming with us, one way or another." Derek tilted his head, his expression calm, but his words edged with warning. "Son, you're standing in the middle of a neighborhood full of witnesses, with half a dozen cameras pointed at you, and you're threatening to restrain me on my own property. Think about how that's going to look when the real police arrive. Do you really want your face plastered all over the evening news as the man who thought cosplay made him an officer?" Eddie's grip tightened around the cuffs dangling at his side, but his feet faltered, and Sean seized the chance to mutter again, louder this time. "I don't like this, Janet. We should leave. This is going to blow back on us." Janet snapped, desperation sharpening her tone. "No, he's been a problem since the day he moved here. If we let him walk away from this, everyone will think he's above the rules. We can't let that happen." Derek locked eyes with her, his voice dropping low but carrying further than a shout. "Respect isn't forced with fake cops, Janet. Respect is earned, and you've lost it." The neighbors murmured again, their disapproval sharpening into something closer to outrage. From across the street, an older man stepped forward, his gray hair glinting in the sunlight as he called out, "I've lived here 30 years, Janet. You've gone too far." His wife, standing beside him, added, "We told you one day this would blow up in your face." The sting of their words seemed to cut deeper than Derek's calm dismantling. Janet had counted on her community's silence, but silence was no longer her ally. Derek took another slow step forward, closing the space between himself and Eddie, his tone cold but measured. "This is your last warning. Walk away now before you dig the hole so deep that no one can pull you out." Eddie's jaw flexed, but his silence was louder than his earlier threats, and the neighbors noticed. Whispers grew into conversations, and conversations into open declarations of support for Derek. Phones tilted, zooming in, capturing every flicker of doubt across Eddie's face and every flash of panic in Janet's eyes. The atmosphere had shifted completely. What had begun as a display meant to intimidate Derek had become a trial where Janet and her enforcers were the defendants, judged not by laws they pretended to wield, but by the neighbors they claimed to protect. And the verdict was already leaning toward condemnation. Derek stood his ground, his composure unbroken, his voice steady. The real test of authority isn't how loud you shout or how hard you push. It's whether the people you claim to serve trust you. And right now, Janet, the only thing people see is fear and fraud. Janet's lips trembled, but she forced her chin higher, refusing to back down, even as the whispers of disapproval grew into a chorus. Eddie looked ready to explode, but Sean took a step back, his hands raised in reluctant surrender. "This is about rules, about order, about protecting what we built." But the more she spoke, the more she sounded desperate, and Derek knew it. He also knew Eddie's type, the kind of man who needed one last grasp at dominance to feel whole. Eddie reached into his vest suddenly, and the sharp metallic clank of steel echoed across the driveway as he pulled out a pair of handcuffs, thrusting them into the air like a weapon. The crowd gasped audibly, neighbors pressing closer to their windows or stepping further onto porches. The sound of the cuffs clicking together seemed louder than lawnmowers or barking dogs, louder than the murmurs rising from every corner of the street. "You're under neighborhood arrest," Eddie barked, his voice cracking just slightly as he tried to mask his fear with bravado. "Don't make me put these on you the hard way." Derek's gaze dropped briefly to the cuffs, then rose again to Eddie's face, his expression calm, almost clinical. He didn't flinch, didn't step back. Instead, his words came slowly, deliberate, each one carrying the weight of years of training. "If you take one more step toward me with those cuffs, you're not just bluffing anymore. You're committing a felony, impersonating an officer, attempted unlawful restraint. That's prison time, Eddie, not community service." Sean's throat bobbed visibly as he swallowed, his face paling. He leaned toward Eddie and muttered harshly, "This is crazy. We can't actually cuff him. We'll get locked up ourselves." Eddie snapped back without looking at him. "Shut up. I've got this." The force of his voice didn't hide the tremor at the edge. Janet, realizing the optics were turning against her faster than she could control, tried to recover, raising her voice with the authority of a stage actor clinging to lines she no longer believed. "Don't let him scare you. This is a law-abiding community. We have every right to enforce standards. He's trying to bully his way out." But her words rang hollow, falling flat against the backdrop of disapproving murmurs. Someone shouted from across the street, "You don't have the right, Janet." Another neighbor added loudly, "This isn't enforcement. It's harassment." Derek took a single step forward, closing the gap slightly, his voice dropping lower, quiet but sharp enough that Eddie had to lean in to hear, while still loud enough for the audience to catch. "I've used real cuffs on real criminals, Eddie. I know what it looks like when a man is bluffing, and I can see it in you. Drop them now, before this turns into something you'll never walk away from." The weight of Derek's words hit harder than any physical shove. Eddie's hand trembled slightly, the cuffs rattling against his palm, and the neighbors noticed. The phone zoomed in, capturing the tiny cracks in his posture, the way his arm shook against the Texas sun. Sean tugged at Eddie's sleeve, his voice trembling now. "Come on, man. Cameras are rolling. We'll get fried for this." But Eddie shoved him back roughly, his pride refusing to surrender. "I said I've got this," he barked, his voice loud but hollow. He stepped forward again, thrusting the cuffs outward like an executioner presenting his blade. The crowd recoiled audibly, gasps and even a scream from someone yelling, "Call the cops." The neighborhood was alive with tension now, phones angled from every direction, the weight of witnesses pressing down. Derek didn't move back, didn't flinch. He planted his feet and spoke in a voice that was calm but laced with command. "You're one heartbeat away from destroying your life. Think hard before you take that step." For the first time, real sweat dripped down Eddie's temple, glistening in the sunlight. His pride and fear battled openly on his face, visible even behind the mirrored shades. Janet saw it too, and her desperation sharpened into fury. "Do it," she screamed, her voice cracking. "Don't let him intimidate you. Put him in cuffs and show this neighborhood who's in charge." Her words backfired immediately. Gasps turned into shouts, the crowd revolting against her audacity. "That's enough, Janet," someone yelled. "You've lost your mind," another shouted louder. "You're not the police." The voices overlapped, rising into a chorus that tore through the false authority she had clung to. Eddie faltered, his grip loosening, his bravado wilting under the weight of communal outrage. Sean took a step back, raising his hands as if to separate himself from the mess, muttering loud enough for neighbors to hear, "I didn't sign up for this." Derek seized the moment, his words like a hammer on fragile glass. "Everyone here sees what's happening. This isn't about rules. This isn't about order. This is about fake power. And when you build your foundation on lies, the truth always tears it down." The crowd erupted, not with applause, but with a low, rumbling agreement, voices overlapping. "He's right. Leave him alone. This is wrong." Eddie's shoulders sagged under the weight of it all, the cuffs dangling uselessly from his fingers. Sean retreated another step, his shame etched into every twitch of his body. Janet, though, refused to yield, her face red and twisted with rage, spitting words that betrayed more than she intended. "You don't belong here, Derek. You never have. That's why you're fighting so hard." The ugliness of her words rang across the block, silencing the murmurs for a moment before they erupted again, this time with sharper outrage. "That's enough, Janet. We all heard that. You're finished." Derek stood firm, his presence radiating calm authority, his expression unwavering even as the chaos of collapsing lies swirled around him. He had spent years dismantling false fronts, men who cloaked themselves in intimidation, and he recognized this moment for what it was, the unraveling of a bluff that could no longer hold. Sean was the first to show his fracture publicly. His shoulders sagged, his hands fidgeted, and his eyes darted from the angry faces of the neighbors to the useless cuffs on the ground. He shook his head and muttered, louder now for everyone to hear, "I didn't sign up for this, Janet. This isn't what you said it would be." His words rippled like shockwaves, and the crowd seized on them instantly. "You hear that?" someone shouted. "They know it's fake." Another voice followed. "This isn't about rules, it's a setup." Derek let the neighbors' outrage grow, his silence acting as fuel to the fire that consumed Janet's authority. Eddie tried to step forward again, his pride wounded, his voice desperate to regain ground. "Don't listen to him. He's lying to you all. We're here to protect this neighborhood." But the tremor in his voice betrayed him, and the sweat running down his temple told the truth. Derek stepped forward slowly, his words precise, his voice low but sharp enough to cut through the pretense. "Protect this neighborhood? By pretending to be cops? By threatening me on my property? You don't even believe your own words anymore." Eddie's jaw clenched, his fists tight at his sides, but his silence stretched longer than his bravado could endure. The neighbors whispered louder, some shaking their heads in disgust, others openly shouting, "This is wrong, Eddie. Walk away," one yelled. Another voice rose above the murmurs. "Janet's been doing this for years, pushing people too far." Derek's eyes flicked toward Janet, and he saw the flush of panic bloom across her face. She tried to mask it, folding her arms tighter, her chin raised in defiance, but the cracks were visible now, the authority she once carried collapsing like sand under a tide. "You all don't understand," she shouted, her voice breaking. "This man has ignored every rule, every warning, every standard we've tried to enforce. He doesn't respect what we built." Derek didn't let her finish. "Respect," he said, his tone razor-sharp. "Respect isn't built on threats and fear. It's built on trust. And look around you, Janet. Do you see anyone here who trusts you anymore?" The neighbors erupted, some shouting he's right, while others jeered at Janet, their voices cutting into her like knives. Sean could no longer bear the weight of the crowd's judgment. He reached up, ripped the Velcro patch reading community enforcement from his vest, and tossed it onto the pavement. The cheap fabric fluttered down beside the discarded cuffs, symbols of the illusion now lying broken at Derek's feet. The crowd gasped, then murmured in agreement, recording every second as Sean took 2 steps back, raising his hands in surrender. "I'm done," he muttered. "I'm out. This isn't worth it." His words carried the sting of betrayal for Janet, whose eyes widened in fury. "Coward," she shrieked at him. "You can't just walk away now." But Sean didn't flinch. He had already surrendered to the truth, and the crowd rewarded him with silence that felt almost like absolution. Derek seized the moment, turning to Eddie, whose trembling grip on his pride was slipping further by the second. "That's one down," Derek said, his voice calm but cutting. "What about you, Eddie? Are you ready to admit the truth, or are you going to drag yourself deeper into a hole you can't climb out of?" Eddie's hands trembled again, the sweat on his forehead shining in the hot Texas sun. His voice cracked as he tried to salvage his stance. I'm not walking away. We were brought here to do a job." Derek leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a register meant for Eddie, but carried just enough for the neighbors to hear. "And who brought you here? Who convinced you to throw away your life on a stunt like this? Janet won't be standing next to you in a courtroom. She won't be the one serving time. She'll save herself, and you'll be left alone." Eddie's silence said more than words could. His grip loosened slightly, the cuffs rattling faintly against his thigh as his bravado drained from him like water from a cracked cup. Janet, frantic now, screamed, "Don't listen to him, Eddie. Put him in cuffs." Do it now." But the crowd snapped back instantly. "That's enough, Janet," one neighbor shouted. Another louder, "We're watching all of this. You're finished." Eddie faltered visibly, the weight of the community's condemnation pressing harder than Derek's words. Derek straightened, his tone rising just enough to address not only Eddie, but the entire neighborhood. "This is the end of the game. You don't have power here. You never did. And the longer you stand here pretending, the deeper the hole you dig." The crowd murmured in agreement, their voices a chorus of support for Derek, while Janet's isolation grew sharper, more visible with each passing second. Her neighbors, who once tolerated her authority, were now openly condemning her, their phones capturing her collapse in real time. Eddie finally let out a shaky breath, his arm dropping to his side, the cuffs clinking against his leg as his strength faltered. The illusion of control had cracked wide open, exposed for the entire neighborhood to see. Derek bent down slowly, picked up the discarded patch and the cuffs, and held them up for the crowd. "This," he said firmly, his voice carrying like a gavel striking down, "is what happens when people confuse control with justice, when they mistake fear for respect. But this isn't justice. It's fraud." Sean Miller had already retreated, the Velcro patch ripped from his chest. His shoulders slumped in defeat as he stepped away from the center of the chaos. But Eddie refused to yield. He bent quickly, scooping the cuffs back up from where Derek had dropped them, his trembling hands grasping the cold steel like a lifeline to the authority he was desperate to maintain. The crowd gasped again as the metallic sound sliced through their murmurs. "You're not walking away from this," Eddie barked, though his voice cracked as he thrust the cuffs toward Derek, the gesture more a plea than a threat. Janet, desperate to salvage her position, screamed over the neighbors' objections. "Do it. Cuff him now. Show them you mean business." But her desperation only highlighted her collapse. Derek stayed perfectly still, calm but alert, his years of training sharpening his instincts. He knew men like Eddie cornered, humiliated, their pride in pieces, and he knew what they would do when fear and arrogance collided. Eddie lunged forward with a clumsy burst of aggression, shoving past Sean and closing the gap between himself and Derek with the cuffs raised like a weapon. The crowd's collective gasp echoed like thunder, some shouting warnings, others screaming to call the police. But Derek was already moving. His body shifted with a precision born from years of federal training, his reflexes executing the move before thought even had time to catch up. He sidestepped Eddie's lunge with fluid grace, seized his arm in a swift grip, and twisted it behind his back in one seamless motion. Eddie cried out, not in pain, but in shock, his momentum broken, his body locked by Derek's controlled force. The cuffs he had brandished now snapped shut around his own wrists in an ironic reversal that drew a roar from the crowd, disbelief and awe mixing in their voices. "Did you see that?" one neighbor shouted. "He didn't even fight him, he just moved," another yelled. Phones tilted higher, capturing the moment from every angle, recording the sound of steel ratcheting into place as Eddie Barnes, who had pretended to be law enforcement, now knelt restrained on the very driveway where he had tried to assert false power. Derek kept his composure, his grip firm but not cruel, his tone calm and professional. "You're done. Don't resist. It will only make it worse," he said, as though addressing any other suspect he had detained in his career. Janet's face twisted into horror, her voice breaking with rage. "What are you doing? You can't arrest him. This isn't your right." Derek's eyes snapped to her, sharp and cold. "You're right," he said evenly. "I can't arrest him, but I can detain him for impersonating an officer until real law enforcement arrives. And considering he just attempted to assault me on my property, the charges against him are stacking fast." The neighbors erupted again, some clapping, others shouting their outrage at Janet. "This is on you, Janet. You pushed them too far. You caused this." Sean backed further away, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. His voice cracked with genuine fear as he blurted, "I'm out. I didn't touch anybody. I swear I didn't sign up for this mess." His words cut Janet like another knife, further exposing her role as the mastermind. Derek, still holding Eddie restrained with one hand, reached calmly into his pocket with the other. The neighbors hushed as he pulled out a worn leather wallet, flicked it open with practiced ease, and revealed the golden badge glinting in the sunlight. "I'm Special Agent Derek Williams," he announced clearly, his voice carrying over the entire block. "Federal Bureau of Investigation." Silence rippled across the street, broken only by the rustle of leaves in the hot breeze and the ragged sound of Eddie's breathing. Every phone zoomed in, capturing the badge, the authority, the undeniable truth that the man they had tried to frame and intimidate was far more than they ever imagined. Mrs. Henderson, standing across the street with her husband, clutched his arm and whispered loudly enough to be heard, "I knew it. I knew he carried himself differently." Caleb Johnson, still live streaming, shouted, "No way. He's FBI." The neighbors' shock was palpable, their disbelief giving way to admiration and vindication. Derek's gaze locked on Janet, his voice hard but steady. "You came onto my property with imposters. You endangered your neighbors, thinking intimidation would give you control. But you didn't do your homework. You had no idea who you were dealing with." Janet tried to recover, her lips quivering as she stammered, This is abuse of power. You can't just..." Derek cut her off with a voice like steel. "Abuse of power? That's rich coming from the woman who staged a fake arrest over HOA complaints. What I'm doing is lawful. What you did is criminal." The murmurs of disgust spread through the crowd again, neighbors shaking their heads, muttering about how far Janet had gone. Derek tightened his grip on Eddie just enough to keep him steady, then raised his voice to the witnesses around him. "Let's be clear, this isn't about lawn height or driveways. This is about people pretending to have authority they don't, people who think fear is leadership. And that ends today." Eddie groaned, his pride shattered, while Sean looked like he might collapse from the weight of his panic. For years, Derek had been the man who waved while mowing his lawn, the quiet resident who kept to himself. But in a single moment, he had transformed in their eyes into something entirely different, a figure of authority and respect that none of them had expected. The weight of that revelation alone might have been enough to end the confrontation, but the distant wail of sirens rolling toward the block signaled that the situation was about to reach its true climax. Derek tightened his grip on Eddie just enough to remind him resistance was futile, his calm voice steady. "Stay still. Don't add to the charges. When the officers arrive, I'll turn you over." Eddie's pride was in tatters, his body sagging as the reality of his situation pressed down. Sean Miller, already stripped of his vest and patch, looked panicked, his hands raised as he muttered, "I didn't touch anybody. I'm not part of this anymore." Janet's face had gone pale, her lips trembling as she tried to speak, but found no words that carried conviction. The neighbors murmured louder, their anticipation building as the sirens grew clearer, the flashing red and blue lights reflecting faintly off the windows at the end of the street. Derek knew this moment was crucial. The imposters had been exposed, Janet's credibility destroyed, but the arrival of real law enforcement would cement everything. He stood tall, his posture unflinching, his badge still in hand for all to see. The first patrol car turned the corner sharply, its lights casting red and blue across the brick facades of the quiet suburban homes, and another followed close behind. The squeal of tires crunching against asphalt silenced the murmurs for a beat, all eyes fixed on the unfolding scene. Doors flung open, and two uniformed officers stepped out cautiously, their hands hovering near their belts, their eyes sweeping the crowd and then landing on the surreal sight before them. A federal agent standing firm with a man cuffed on his knees, another accomplice retreating to the curb, and a woman in professional attire shrieking incoherently at the neighbors who were openly condemning her. "Hands where we can see them," one officer barked, his voice authoritative, commanding the scene. Without hesitation, Derek raised his free hand slowly, his other hand maintaining control of Eddie. His voice was calm, professional, and carried across the tense air. "Officers, I'm Special Agent Derek Williams, FBI. Badge is in my pocket, identification ready. The man in my custody attempted to impersonate law enforcement and assaulted me on my property." The neighbors erupted again, voices layering over one another as they shouted confirmations. "It's true, he's FBI. We saw it all. They tried to cuff him with fake badges. The officers paused, their eyes darting between Derek's badge, the restrained man, and the crowd of witnesses. The taller officer, Ramirez, stepped forward cautiously, extending his hand. "Let me see your credentials, sir." Derek gave a nod, keeping Eddie restrained while carefully reaching into his pocket with his free hand. He produced his FBI identification wallet and handed it over without a shred of hesitation. Ramirez studied it closely, then glanced back up at Derek, his expression shifting into one of respect and relief. "All right, Agent Williams. You're good. We'll take him from here." The younger officer, Green, moved swiftly, taking hold of Eddie as Ramirez relieved Derek of the burden. Eddie sagged against the officer's grip, his bravado utterly gone. The neighbors erupted with murmurs of satisfaction, some even clapping, their relief palpable now that the imposter had been secured by real police. Janet, however, could not contain her desperation. "Wait," she screamed, stepping forward, her arms flailing as if trying to claw back the authority slipping from her grasp. "He's twisting everything. I'm the HOA president. These men were authorized to enforce community standards. You have to believe me." Officer Green's sharp eyes narrowed as she took in Janet's frantic expression. Her tone was firm, measured. "Ma'am, from what I'm hearing, this looks very bad for you. Did you authorize these men to impersonate law enforcement?" Janet's mouth opened, but no coherent answer came out. The crowd roared with accusations. "She brought them here. We saw it. She told them to arrest him." Ramirez's jaw tightened as he turned to Janet. "Ma'am, step aside. If you continue to interfere, we'll have to treat this as obstruction." Janet shook her head violently, her face pale, but the realization settled on her that the neighbors she once ruled over were now condemning her openly, and the officers weren't swayed by her title. Derek watched silently, his disappointment in her etched across his features. He didn't need to say more. The community had spoken for him. Sean raised his hands higher, his voice trembling as he blurted, "I didn't want any part of this. I'll cooperate. I'll tell you everything." She set this up. His confession sent another ripple through the crowd, sealing Janet's fate even further. The officers nodded curtly, signaling to another unit to escort Sean for questioning. The murmurs from the crowd grew into louder declarations, neighbors whispering to one another about justice finally being served, about years of intimidation finally collapsing under its own weight. Ramirez returned Derek's badge with a nod of respect. "You handled this by the book, Agent Williams. Could have gone south fast, but you kept it controlled." Derek's response was simple, his tone steady. "My goal was to prevent bloodshed. Control without chaos. That's always the goal." Green gave him a look of admiration, her voice quiet but clear. "Most civilians would have lost control long before now. You made our job easier today." Derek inclined his head slightly, his expression never gloating, never self-congratulatory. "I didn't want anyone hurt. That's all that mattered." The flashing lights painted the street in alternating red and blue, illuminating the grim truth of what had nearly happened. Eddie was now seated in the back of a squad car, cuffed and defeated, while Sean prepared to give a statement under the watchful eyes of another officer. Janet stood isolated, her shoulders hunched, her face twisted with humiliation as the neighbors whispered, their phones recording her every movement, every futile protest. A man shouted from across the street, "It's over. Janet, you're done." Eddie Barnes had already been escorted into the back of the patrol car, his head bowed, his bravado broken, and Sean Miller stood off to the side with his hands raised, muttering that he would cooperate, that he would tell the officers everything they needed to know. But the one who had not yet been dealt with was Janet Moore, and Derek could see the desperation in her eyes as she realized the walls were closing in. She tried to raise her chin, folding her arms as if posture alone could shield her from the truth. But the murmurs of the neighbors pressed in on her like a tide she could not push back. "She brought them here," one woman shouted. "We saw it with our own eyes," another voice added. "She told them to arrest him." The chorus of condemnation swelled. The once silent neighbors, now united in their judgment. Officer Ramirez, who had already confirmed Derek's credentials, turned toward Janet with a look that was no longer curious but stern, the kind of look that carried the weight of official authority. "Ma'am," he said firmly, "we need you to step aside. We'll be taking statements, and from what we've already gathered, you may have a serious role in this incident. If you resist, it will only make things worse for you." Janet shook her head violently, her voice trembling as she shouted back, "No, you don't understand. I'm the president of this HOA. It's my responsibility to keep order." He ignored every rule, every fine, every warning. I had no choice. But her words fell flat, bouncing uselessly off the neighbors who had already chosen their side. Officer Green stepped forward, her expression unyielding. "Ma'am, your title doesn't give you the authority to authorize impersonation of law enforcement or to attempt an unlawful detention. In fact, it puts you in a worse position because you should have known better." The words struck Janet hard, her lips quivering as she tried to respond, but the neighbors erupted again, drowning her out. "You should be ashamed," shouted one man from his porch. "You put us all at risk," cried another. The Hendersons, who had watched the entire ordeal unfold from across the street, shook their heads in disbelief. Mr. Henderson raised his voice so everyone could hear. "This is what happens when someone mistakes control for leadership. You've embarrassed yourself, Janet, and you've embarrassed this neighborhood." His wife added, her voice sharper, "We warned you this day would come. Now you're facing the consequences." Janet's face turned crimson, her anger boiling over. She spun toward Derek, pointing a trembling finger. "You did this. You humiliated me. You manipulated them all against me." Derek met her gaze calmly, his voice even but firm. "No, Janet. You did this to yourself. You staged a fake arrest. You brought imposters into our neighborhood, and you threatened me in front of every neighbor here. All I did was stand my ground." The truth exposed itself. The crowd murmured in agreement, their support for Derek growing stronger with every passing moment. Officer Ramirez gave a curt nod to Green, who stepped closer to Janet. "Ma'am, we're going to need you to come with us downtown to provide a statement. If you resist, we'll have no choice but to detain you for obstruction." The neighbors held their phones higher, capturing the moment in which the woman who had ruled the HOA with an iron fist now faced the collapse of her authority. Janet's eyes darted from side to side, searching desperately for an ally, but all she found were the condemning stares of the very people she had once controlled. Even Sean, standing pale and nervous near the curb, shook his head slowly as though silently disowning her. Janet let out a cry, half fury and half despair. "You can't do this to me. I've dedicated years to this community. Without me, this place will fall apart." The neighbors shouted back instantly, their voices like a verdict. "You're the one tearing it apart. We'll be better without you. Your time is over." The cacophony washed over Janet, and Derek could see her knees weaken slightly as the weight of collective rejection bore down on her. Officer Green placed a firm hand on her arm, guiding her gently but decisively toward the patrol car. Janet tried to pull away at first, but the officer's grip tightened, and with the flashing lights illuminating her shame, she had no choice but to walk. The neighbors whispered loudly, some openly recording, others muttering with satisfaction. "It's about time," one said. "We've lived under her nonsense for too long," another added. Derek remained silent, his expression steady but not vindictive. He didn't take pleasure in Janet's fall. Instead, he recognized it for what it was, a necessary reckoning, a moment where truth replaced intimidation, where the balance of authority shifted from arrogance to accountability. As Janet was guided past him, her face twisted with fury and humiliation, she hissed, "You think you've won, Derek, but people like you will never truly belong here." The crowd reacted instantly, a collective gasp followed by louder condemnation. "That's enough, Janet. We all heard you. You're finished." Derek's voice cut through their outrage, calm and final. "You just told them exactly who you are, Janet, and that will stay with you far longer than anything I could ever say." Janet's shoulders slumped, her defiance crumbling as she was led to the squad car. She climbed in reluctantly, her once proud stature reduced to a shadow of itself. The doors closed with a heavy thud that sounded to the neighbors like the end of an era. The crowd buzzed with satisfaction, some clapping softly, others whispering about justice finally being served. Derek remained still, watching as the patrol car prepared to pull away, his thoughts not on triumph, but on the lesson the entire block had just witnessed. The patrol car carrying Janet Moore rolled slowly down the block, its flashing red and blue lights painting the quiet Texas street with harsh truth, while neighbors stood rooted in place, some still recording, others whispering to one another about the spectacle they had just witnessed. Derek Williams remained at the edge of his driveway, his posture steady, his face calm, his badge once again tucked away in his pocket. He didn't look triumphant, and he didn't gloat. He stood as though carved in stone, watching the car disappear, knowing that what had unfolded in front of his home was not just about him, not just about Janet, not just about the two imposters who had tried to pretend at authority. It was about everyone in the neighborhood, every family who had peeked from behind blinds for years, afraid to speak out against overreach, every parent who had tolerated intimidation out of fear of fines or retaliation, every child who had watched grown adults confuse control with leadership. The sound of radios crackling and officers giving final instructions broke the heavy silence. Officer Ramirez nodded respectfully at Derek and said, "Agent Williams, we'll handle it from here. Statements will be taken, evidence secured, and charges filed. You kept this from spiraling out of control, and that's not something we can say about most standoffs like this." Derek inclined his head slightly, his tone calm but clear. "My goal was simple. Nobody needed to bleed on this driveway today. Nobody needed to lose more than they already had." Green, the younger officer, gave him a look of quiet admiration before turning back to her unit. The crowd began to disperse slowly, neighbors still buzzing with conversation, still replaying the events in their minds. Some walked over to Derek, offering words of gratitude. Mrs. Henderson spoke first, her voice warm and strong. "Agent Williams, you showed us all something today. You showed us what real leadership looks like. Not shouting, not intimidation, not fake titles, but standing firm when it mattered." Derek gave her a faint nod. "I didn't do it for recognition. I did it because it was the right thing to do." Bullies thrive on silence, and silence is what allows them to grow. Once people speak up, once the truth comes into the light, fear has no grip anymore. Her husband added, "We'll remember this day, Derek. You did this neighborhood a service none of us will forget." Across the street, Caleb Johnson, the teenager who had live-streamed the entire confrontation, jogged over, his phone still in his hand. "Mr. Williams, that video's already blowing up online. People everywhere are watching what happened here. They're calling you a hero." Derek gave him a small smile, one that held no vanity. "I'm not a hero, Caleb. I just refuse to be bullied. But if people are watching, make sure they understand the lesson. Authority isn't about fear. It's about accountability. If your video spreads that message, then it's worth more than anything else." Caleb nodded eagerly, clearly moved, and promised to share it the right way. More neighbors approached, and Derek greeted them politely, though he kept his responses brief. He wasn't a man who sought the spotlight. He simply wanted to ensure that the community understood what had happened. Later that evening, when the sirens had faded and the squad cars were gone, the neighborhood gathered in the small park at the center of the subdivision. The HOA board, humbled by the scandal, called a special meeting to address what had occurred and to decide the future of the community's leadership. Nearly every household was represented. Families sitting on folding chairs, children running in the grass, but pausing when the voices of the adults grew serious. Derek had not intended to speak, but the interim board president, Harold Jennings, asked him to step forward. The neighbors hushed as he approached, their eyes fixed on him. He did not raise his voice much, but everyone leaned in, eager to hear the man whose composure had dismantled the tyrant in real time. "What happened today," Derek began, "wasn't about one driveway or one lawn or one set of rules. It was about something bigger. It was about the danger of letting fear masquerade as authority. When people are too afraid to question, when they stay silent in the face of intimidation, it allows corruption to grow unchecked. What you saw here today is what happens when false power is confronted by truth." He paused, letting his words sink in. The neighbors nodded, their murmurs carrying a rhythm of agreement. "Leadership isn't about titles," he continued. "It isn't about control or intimidation. Leadership is about service. It's about earning respect by putting people first, even when it's inconvenient, even when it doesn't earn you credit." Janet forgot that, and she mistook fear for respect. That mistake is why she fell. The crowd absorbed his words quietly, the lesson hitting home in a way no set of HOA bylaws ever could. A hand shot up in the crowd. It was Mrs. Henderson again. "Agent Williams, what should we do the next time someone tries to pull something like this?" Derek's response was immediate, his voice steady. "Stand together. Speak up. Don't let fear isolate you." The only reason Janet thought she could get away with this is because she assumed everyone would stay quiet. Silence is what bullies feed on. But when people stand together and speak the truth, intimidation collapses. The neighbors clapped softly at first, then louder as the message resonated. Parents whispered to their children, reinforcing the lesson. Caleb, standing at the back with his phone still recording, grinned and called out, "That's going online too, Mr. Williams." Derek gave him a faint nod and allowed himself the smallest smile. As the meeting drew to a close, the neighbors lingered, speaking to one another more openly than they had in years. Strangers introduced themselves, friendships began forming, and the tension that had once defined the street seemed to dissolve into something lighter. It was not perfect, but it was a start. Later that night, Derek stood at the end of his driveway again, the same spot where it had all begun. The quiet hum of the street returned, sprinklers hissing in the dark, porch lights flickering on as families prepared for bed. He thought back to the cuffs clattering on the concrete, to Sean tossing his patch to the ground, to Janet's final desperate shriek. And he knew the neighborhood would never look at that driveway the same way again. But he also knew that the true meaning of the day was not in his victory, but in the lesson the community had absorbed. Sometimes the greatest battles are not fought overseas or in distant cities. Sometimes they are fought at home, on the very streets where children play and families build their lives. And those battles are won not with fear, but with truth, not with intimidation, but with courage, not with titles, but with accountability. Derek whispered quietly to himself, as if to anchor the thought, the truth always comes to light. He picked up the empty trash can from the curb, carried it back toward his garage, and paused to glance once more at the quiet street now free of flashing lights and chaos. Life would move forward, but nothing would be quite the same. The neighbors had seen what false authority looked like, and they had seen how it crumbled in the face of accountability. They would remember the lesson, that real power doesn't come from fear, but from service and truth. And that was the ending Derek wanted them to carry long after the sirens faded. The end. If this story made you think about what real authority means and how quickly false power can crumble, make sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What part of the plot stood out to you the most? And how do you think you would have reacted if this happened in your own neighborhood? Drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from, because these stories reach people everywhere and your perspective matters.